I'm pretty black-pilled on politics. But I'm definitely optimistic still because I think that there will be a lot of freedom technology that just allows you to opt out or that just allows you to not comply in a way that allows you to get away with it. I think that's the way to go. Freedom technology is definitely the way to go.
What is up, guys? Welcome back to Bitcoin Audible. I am Guy Swan, the guy who has read more about Bitcoin than anybody else you know. This show is brought to you by Swan Bitcoin and CoinKite. Swan Bitcoin is where you are going to buy your Bitcoin, and for the next $10,000 worth of Bitcoin you purchase, there will be no fees at all. And then you want to send it to your cold card hardware wallet. You want to make sure that you have a secure device where you hold the keys. And you can get a discount on the cold card, too. On top of the fact that it is a fantastic device. It is one of my favorites. I got one sitting around here somewhere. Here it is. This is my little cold card Mark IV, and I got a cold card Q on the way as well. Super stoked about it. But check it out. Details and the link will be in the show notes as well as my discount code. All right. We have a fantastic conversation today. So I saw a post on Nostr from Travis West talking about the Samourai case and what was happening. He actually has a background in law enforcement. He was a detective, and he specifically found his own little specialty in Bitcoin, in blockchain analysis, and in cybercrime, and chasing down people involved in child exploitation and fraud, and stealing funds from vulnerable people, and tracking that down. So I thought he had not only was the post fantastic, which I will have a link to in the show notes if you want to read that, just to kind of get a precursor as to this conversation, but I thought he had a really interesting perspective on what was going on, both on the legal side, but also just, what's happening in that environment, and, what kind of history informs how they treat or how they think about the quote unquote good guys and the bad guys. So I immediately reached out to him, and we were like, let's get a show together. And that is what this is. And I'm really excited to share it because we had a fantastic conversation. So without further ado, let's just go ahead and get in. This is our conversation with Travis West on Bitcoin Audible. Privacy is a crime. Dude, Travis, welcome to the show. Welcome to Bitcoin Audible. It's exciting to have you here. This is actually an area that I haven't really explored much on the show, just because it's not technical or philosophical, really. Well, I mean, granted, we'll probably kind of go in that direction some as well. But you had a fantastic post on Nostr, which kind of called attention to all of this because of everything that's happened with Samourai and all of that stuff. And your background specifically was interesting, and I thought would be like really useful to kind of dig into. So why don't you just introduce yourself, what your background is, and why you might have some insight into this situation, and what the consequences of it are.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. Thanks for having me on your show. So I used to be a law enforcement officer, and fairly quickly in my career, a few years in, I went into detectives. And so as a detective, I ended up specializing. So usually you focus on something and you get really good at it, right? And you kind of excel in certain fields. So like some guys will focus on, canines or SWAT or stuff like that. I focused more on the cybercrime elements of cases. And so I was on a bunch of regional teams. And so these were like task forces. And one of them was a human trafficking team, and then another one was a major crime team that worked mainly like homicides, robberies, that kind of stuff. And so I would handle like the cyber components of the major crime one. So if you imagine having like a suspect or a victim, and they have a Google account, Apple account, Microsoft account, or phone, then I would try to exploit all of that data associated with those. And so when I say phone, I'm not talking about the actual physical device, like as far as extracting data from it. It's actually like me reaching out to the cellular networks that are providing you service and getting all of the data from them and kind of triangulating locations for phones, that kind of stuff. And so essentially, if there was a component of a crime that took place over the internet or over cellular networks, then I would try to exploit that. And so I got to learn a lot about fraud, because fraud nowadays takes place over the internet primarily for the majority, right? And so any kind of like fraud case or scam case or some of those serious cases that just happen to have a component that touches the internet, I had to learn how to exploit that. And so a lot of it is tracing people through the internet. I'm trying to identify someone. And so money laundering is like always a component of fraud cases, because there's movement of funds that are occurring, right? There's like a theft that occurs. There's funds that are being moved. And so you can always like articulate money laundering into that. Now, in my area, we'd never actually touched money laundering charges, but I understood those. We would really focus on the fact that funds were stolen and they moved, and we're just trying to get the funds back. So it's more of a private property violation that we're investigating. That's how I looked at it, right? I was a pretty libertarian detective. And so that's kind of my background as far as the cybercrime stuff, the money laundering stuff. And then, I focus a lot on fraud, and a lot of the fraud nowadays is touching the crypto sphere. A lot of it's starting in Bitcoin. And so I had to learn how to follow the flow of money through those networks, right? And so that's around the same time I was just getting, on the personal side, really interested in Bitcoin. I'm a pretty big libertarian, and I was becoming like more radicalized as I was going down that rabbit hole, right? As most of us do. And so it was kind of, Bitcoin was a hobby of mine, and I also was just having to analyze transactions on that network and a lot of the shitcoin networks. So I have a big background in that.
Gotcha. How long were you doing that?
I did the detective stuff probably for maybe 6 or 7 years, if I had to guess, if I had to put a number on it.
What turned you away from it? What are you doing now?
I work at Swan now, and so I went down that Bitcoin rabbit hole.
No shit, I didn't even know that.
I went down that Bitcoin rabbit hole, and I just became, Bitcoin was very clearly the most important mission, right? And so if you have the opportunity to work in it full time, so I jumped ship. I no longer am doing law enforcement stuff at all. Not even, they were shocked, the other agencies I worked with. Because you're doing good work. I was doing really good work with them. But there's elements of law enforcement that just rubbed me the wrong way. Like I was listening to a lot of Michael Malice and Dave Smith, and I just was like, we need to privatize all of this. What are we doing? Like, this is socialized law enforcement. This is some BS. And so there's a lot of elements with law enforcement today that I just disagree with, and it rubbed me the wrong way. And I was happy to, work cases and try to solve like serious crimes, but I just had that itch. I needed to work in Bitcoin and just focus entirely on that. So that's what I did. That's what I'm doing now.
That's so funny. I didn't catch that you worked at Swan, and this show is brought to you by Swan Bitcoin. So you did that for a minute and had some really interesting kind of foundations, I guess, to then kind of apply to what's going on in the space. I'm just kind of generally curious, before we get into the more Bitcoin side of things, what was your favorite thing about doing it?
So it was really fun figuring out like who the bad guy was in some of these cases.
Yeah.
There was a lot of cases. We had in my area, we have a lot of older folks, a lot of folks being just falling victim to scams and pig butchering cases, we call them, where they're basically getting involved with a suspect online, and they're being tricked into sending sometimes their life savings to these bad actors. And so you have like the starting point will be, I have like a suspect phone number, maybe a suspect email, maybe a website that they're using, and I have maybe a few other details, and then I have like a flow of money, probably like cash into Bitcoin, and then onward. And so with those starting points, I have to investigate all those and try to exploit all those, via court orders, search warrants, subpoenas, or in the case of like public blockchains, just looking at it and trying to figure out, who these guys are. And a lot of times they're making mistakes and you're able to identify them. And so, but these are like cases where, in my opinion, like someone's private property rights were violated. And I'm just trying to hopefully catch up to the money. That usually didn't happen. But at least identify them and try to hold them accountable. This kind of stuff's like applied to cases that don't involve property, don't involve actual victims, right? You're talking about like someone protesting too hard or protesting the wrong way, right? Or crimes that are questionable, where there's a questionable victim, like not registering with the right authorities, not having the right licensing, not following certain
you didn't fill out the paperwork properly, and
certain things that are like that I already perceive as manipulating the market and interfering with the market, and you're not going along with it, so you're going to be criminalized. So a lot of that can be applied. A lot of what I did could be applied to that. I had the benefit of working for a sheriff, though, that was very like constitutional, U.S. constitutional focused and pretty libertarian himself. And so I could like I could say no to certain cases, right? So I would never work with like gun cases.
Nice.
I didn't work drug cases. I wouldn't do, I was able to be like a libertarian detective to answer your question.
Awesome.
Yeah, just figuring out who the bad guys were, because they're surprised. Like in the end, like they thought they got away with it, but putting like a nationwide extraditable arrest warrant out for someone that is in like Georgia, and they have to like get hauled all the way back to where I'm at is pretty satisfying.
You said it kind of trended, or maybe this was implied, but it was trending in the wrong direction and kind of, I guess, getting less about what you liked about it. Like, in what way is that kind of environment changing? Are you seeing more of the like get people for non-compliance? Are most detectives in a situation where they can't say no to a case? They just get given cases?
Well, it'll vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and agency to agency. So you might have like an agency where it's just very top down, and you get assigned cases and you work them, and the amount of effort you're putting into it, I'm sure, will vary depending on how much you feel, how much you empathize with what you're doing. But sometimes, certainly you could have a situation where you're forced to look into something. I think a lot of detectives, it's probably fair to say, are just interested in doing their work, their job, and they're probably not thinking too hard into the philosophy behind it. Like I would have conversations with a lot of them, but I'm more, I'm someone that's always questioned like authority and questioned like why does this law exist, and is there a better way to do it? Or sometimes people don't ask those questions and they just sort of follow orders. But as far as like a trend, I think this is a problem that's always existed. Like even in militaries and stuff and companies, there's always going to be like yes men that just go along with it, and they're making money. They're earning for their families, and
it's their livelihood.
So like if you're principled is one thing, and then if you're principled enough to be resistant to your boss potentially, like that's another thing too, right? Like how much do you push back? So
no, that's a good point. It's so funny that I've talked about that a little bit in the different context on the show, is that like no matter what situation you're in, is that if you actually have savings, if you're not like drowning in debt, you actually kind of have that option to kind of put your shoulders back and stand up for what you think. And you have the option of kind of giving your boss the middle finger, or implying the middle finger in a conversation when you're being asked to do something that you don't ethically agree with. And especially if you have the time to actually think about what those consequences are, which again is a question of, do you have savings or do you have debt? Are you paycheck to paycheck, or do you have 3 months of runway if this sheriff fires you or something? And how much that degrades our ability to even stand up or enforce or even stand behind in any sense our values in the economy and in what we do. And the fiat money just kind of like rips that out of us and kind of starts to rot your soul, that if you can't say no, that, what are you even being a part of, at that point? I want to ask too, since you kind of have hands-on experience here, is I hear all the time that, privacy tools and all of this stuff are ruining it for law enforcement, and it's all just getting harder and harder, and they can't do their job because, Tor exists and because Bitcoin exists, or Samourai Wallet exists. Do you see that as being true? Is it getting harder and harder to solve crime because of all of the tools and technology? Is it getting easier? Is it just kind of the same with a different landscape? Like how do you think that's actually unfolding?
That's a really good question. That's a good question. So in my experience, actually, most of the suspects I was trying to track down weren't using any privacy tools. They might use maybe a VPN, but I mean, a lot of it's just a matter of a lot of what I saw was just funds are being moved, they're being swapped, they're being bridged, and you're able to trace through all of it. And it happens really fast. It happens actually too fast, probably to catch up to the funds and try to freeze them or stop them. And so it's really just if you can't stop the money moving, then it's really the game I was playing was just trying to identify the suspects. So I'm probably not going to catch up to the funds. And then in that case, a lot of times they're not using the tools, or, a lot of times the guys I was after are trying to cash out. And so they're, sending everything to centralized exchanges that allow them to cash out. And then that part of it is, what identity are they using? Because usually you have to have some sort of identity associated with that, like with your KYC, right? And so, are they using their own identity, or are they using someone else's that they're just, if they're like from India or Nigeria, like, can they just pay someone $1 on the street and use their identity, right? So there's like a lot of options that have nothing really to do with the tools. It's just the other associates you're using that may or may not know what you're doing. But as far as, I had a few cases that would like touch it, where the funds are going into a Wasabi wallet, or they're going into Samourai Wallet's Whirlpool. And I would see that personally as touche. That's cool. And then I would just go, I would stop there, and I would go and look at all the other leads that I usually had. And there was only a few times where I would just stop and not continue with the case. And that could also be non-compliant exchanges that the funds go to, where they just have a reputation of not cooperating. And sometimes I would email them and say like, hey, I know you don't need to listen to me or anything if I'm asking for information, but this is what I'm doing. And so, just on the off chance that they're sympathetic to like some old lady and her money lost, right? But so I would like personally just look at these tools as just kind of like someone using a VPN. It's like, I'm not mad at Proton. I'm not mad at Movad. It's like, those are just tools that these guys are using, and they just happen to commit a crime. And so I didn't like, now, there are cases where maybe there's a really large amount of money, and you actually have the capability, potentially, depending on how many mistakes the bad actors are doing, of demixing, of actually following the funds through these services. But a lot of times that has to do with the bad guy being impatient, the bad guy making mistakes. It's kind of technically outside of what the service is offering. It's really the bad guys messing it up themselves. And a lot of that is a lot easier, obviously, with like a larger pool of funds, because liquidity becomes an issue with a lot of services. Or the liquidity that you're trying to move will create certain patterns on the back end that you can identify sometimes really easy. And so there is like, just with the cases I was working, we're smaller, right? I'm not going to be investigating like a $500 million heist or something, right? Like that's going to be a different set of people, different team. But that's kind of how I saw the tools, and I just saw them literally as tools, and they just happen to be used by a suspect at that moment in time. And
Yeah.
I kind of liked actually when I saw it, because it's kind of like what I said. It's like, oh, touche, sir, good job. You wouldn't see that very often though. There was only a few cases where there was the guy, I'm assuming it's the guy, didn't make any mistakes. Like usually they make a mistake. Usually they even if they're using a VPN, maybe they revealed some, like, the device information in some way, or they messed up along the route, right? And then you're able to expose them. So
have you ever run into a situation where the where you contacted the VPN service and they had logs, even though they said we don't log, and that sort of stuff? Because I've always
yeah.
suspected that happened a lot, but I don't really have any concrete evidence for it. It's just that I don't really
Yeah.
trust NordVPN. You know what I mean? Like, I
Right.
assume somebody has that data somewhere.
I remember hearing about one VPN company, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of it. It wasn't like one of the big ones though that I would recommend usually, but I do remember that they, at the request of law enforcement, exposed some information that they weren't supposed to. I have also heard about a lot of VPN companies being tested and passing that test, like Movad. And I remember sending a subpoena to a VPN company once, and I actually forget what I was asking. I might have been just billing information or something. And I remember the reply that was like, hey, we just don't have anything. We don't have the logs. We don't have what you're asking. And it's okay. All right. Sounds good. But yeah, I didn't have any opportunities to test one, and then they reveal, everything to me or whatnot.
Yeah. What's the craziest thing you ever worked on?
I mean, there was a few homicides where a lot of the probably the better work I did was involving cell phones. And so you have like a situation where you have a suspect or two, and you suspect them of committing a homicide, and you don't even have their phones. Like maybe they ditched them, maybe they still have them and they're on the run. And I would just figure out what their phone number was. Usually that's pretty easy in America. And you just reach out to the cell phone companies that provide their service, and you just seize all the data relevant to that phone. And I had enough training where I could analyze all that data and essentially triangulate, the general whereabout of where they were. And it would vary, like that accuracy. But a lot of times you're able to answer the question like where they weren't or who they communicated with. You could really use that information to inform a case of where they went and when, right? And so a lot of times you're putting them at the crime scene. You're getting them at these locations where we haven't been yet as investigators, and then you go there and you're like finding a weapon or you're finding some evidence, right? And so I did a lot of work with that, with some homicides that ended up really, when you have that kind of data, really collaborating a lot of times what you already know. A lot of times those cases don't even with a homicide, they don't even go into trial. They're just so overwhelming, so good. They just end up taking a deal, and it's all, which is usually easier on if there's victims alive or family members. Usually that's preferred by the system. But yeah, that's probably like the more serious stuff that I worked that was helpful. But some of the like more entertaining cases were involving like I did a lot of online undercover work where I'm trying to find those men. Usually, every single time it was a man in my case. That there's men out there that are evil, and they're targeting children online. They're trying to develop relationships with them, and they're trying to physically meet up with them and do really evil things. And so I would do a lot of work around that. So I'm trying to find those guys. And so I would have a team usually, and we would pretend to be children online that were vulnerable and willing to meet them. And then obviously these guys were pretty disappointed that we scam them essentially and arrest them when they show up.
Yeah.
But those are feel good cases. And we had a lot of support to do that where I was, because we had a real case with a she was 11 and 12, that actually had it was a real child that met up with someone and really bad things happened, right? And so there was like some motivation to detect these kind of guys before they find a real kid. And so those were really good. There's a lot of entertaining cases with that, like dark humored kind of stuff.
Real morbid humor stuff.
It's really gross stuff. Yeah, it's really gross.
Yeah.
And then
God, Jesus.
yeah, and I would do that with the sex trafficking stuff too, where we would pretend to be prostitutes or escorts online, and we'd try to find sex buyers. Those were like the easier missions. But as I was becoming more libertarian, I was like engaging more with people in that space, that anti-sex trafficking space. And that you'll find folks that are advocates for like sex work and that kind of stuff. And they basically convinced me like that we're probably not doing it the most effective way if you're trying to fight like trafficking, like the forced trafficking, as opposed to just, an adult man and adult woman agreeing to trade money for sex, right? Like where they're not doing, where no one's being forced to do it, essentially, right? And so what we did with those ones, we basically, as I kind of had my mind changed about it, we ended up pivoting those cases to where we would pose as an escort, an adult escort online, but then we would introduce the idea that we have a child with us, like a teenage girl, right? And we would entertain that. And then, so we were targeting sex buyers that ended up agreeing to meet a child, to pay for sex with a child. And so obviously like people are way more interested in doing those cases, right? Those are way more righteous. Like everyone kind of agrees, like in that space, at least, that if you have to arrest someone for that, you want the ones that are targeting children. And so that's kind of a combination of our undercover ICAT cases, we call them, like internet crimes against children cases. We kind of add like that element of prostitution to it, or sex trafficking rather, because the idea is that, if it's a child, they're not able to consent to any kind of sexual relationship at all. And so these children are being trafficked. And we would just simply pose as them. We didn't actually use child models or anything like that. We would use usually just law enforcement.
You didn't dangle a bunch of kids as bait?
No. You know what though? Before I left, I was thinking, how neat it would be to have AI get involved in this. We weren't using any.
Oh, man.
But man, the potential there of maybe making like the internet a black hole for people that are trying to have a relationship with children. Because if you never know if it's a real person or just like this, AI.
That's crazy. I hadn't thought about that.
And we would use filtering, right? That would modify, like if you have a young looking female officer or male, I suppose, we would usually use female decoys. We would use filtering, like if they're already look young, you can use filtering to really potentially make some pictures that can trick people, right? And so otherwise you're trying to be more creative, because we wouldn't use actual pictures of children, obviously.
That's crazy. That's so crazy. You said there's some things about it that you can't talk about specifically about the Bitcoin fog case. But I am really curious about that, since this is specifically relevant to the Samourai case, because Bitcoin fog was, for anybody who doesn't know, this was the big mixer back in the Silk Road days, and it's a centralized run mixer. So it's the true definition of like, you give it to a custodian, they mix it, and then they give it back or send it to Silk Road or send it to one of the other numerous darknet markets and all of that stuff. So tell me more about that and kind of the legal view around that before we get into what's going on with Samourai and Tornado Cash.
Yeah, sure. So with Bitcoin fog, like you mentioned, it would have been considered a custodial mixing service, and so which differentiates it pretty significantly from the Samourai Wallet case. But even with the idea of custody, I was still sympathetic because I just don't agree with these money laundering laws in the first place. But yeah, the idea is
Yeah.
that that service is operating as a money service business. It's receiving funds from people, holding it, however briefly, and then sending it onward to either the original user or someone else. And so you can see how it could fit in the definition of a money service business or a money transmitter a little easier, and we can disagree on whether those have to register with the Department of Treasury of the United States. But what bothered me with that Bitcoin fog case was I'm gonna still say alleged. We're appealing, but the alleged suspect, right, Roman Sterlingoff. He was not an American citizen, right? He's Russian and Swedish. And so the idea that like foreigners have to apply or comply with American laws just rubs me the wrong way. Like you have a business where you have a podcast, right? And you probably view your listeners as customers. And so you probably have customers like in Russia. And so like the idea that you ever visit St. Petersburg and then the Russian authorities just pick you up and arrest you because you didn't comply with some law you may or may not have been aware of.
They have censorship laws.
Right?
I know I said something awful about Putin. I'm sure I'm breaking some law. Like that's so crazy to think that I should be in compliance with every jurisdiction on planet Earth because anybody on Earth could listen to my podcast. It's absurd. Yeah.
Yeah, and it kind of goes down to like if you have a business online, it's kind of the nature of the internet, right? Like the internet exists around the globe, and so this idea of like who your customers are, who can access you as a service or business, it's definitely different than having like a physical business in one jurisdiction and you're applicable, you have to comply with those laws. Like it's just different. Like the internet confuses it. And it confuses it with all sorts of things. Like if I stole your credit card information and then used it online from where I am, and then I don't know where you live, but like where did that crime occur? Did it occur on the internet? Did it occur where you live? Did it occur where the bank processed, did it occur where I am? And so we like to answer that, like I would treat it as it occurred both where the victim was and where the suspect was at the same time. And that gave us the ability where I was to prosecute him. But it's tricky though. That's the point I'm trying to raise. Like it's just not the same thing as committing a crime in a physical location. And so, it bothered me that this idea that you have these foreign folks just because they didn't, filter out American IP addresses is essentially like all you can do. That we would hold them accountable to our laws. That bothered me. It bothered me the venue. So, some of the undercover agents that interacted with the service, they were physically located in Washington, D.C. And so the trial occurred in Washington, D.C. And so this idea of being going to trial with a jury of your peers, with this foreign guy that's never been there, has no family or business ties to that area. Like the idea that we could ever categorize those folks as his peers is like absurd, right? And so that bothered me. It just kind of bothered me overall because I just felt like the federal government was policing the internet, and I'm not a fan of that. And so for those reasons, I did reach out and volunteer and help with their defense. So I can only talk about things that are publicly known about the case, and things I've said already are publicly known. But yeah, so those are some of the things that bother me about the case. And the big distinguishing factor is that was a traditional, they took custody, Bitcoin Fog took custody of the funds. And so that does differentiate. With that said, I still don't agree with the laws, but the idea that we're going to lock someone up in prison for that is absurd, especially since like with the Bitcoin network, it is lacking that certain level of privacy, right? And that is trying to be fixed with layers on top of the Bitcoin network. I'm saying layers, but they're services, right? So you have these services that are trying to remedy the privacy problem in Bitcoin. And there are like networks out there that have it built into the protocol level, right? Like Monero.
Mhm.
And so this idea that, if it's built in, we're okay with it. If it's not built in and we have to have like a service or layer on top of it, fix it, like it's suddenly not only wrong, but it's so wrong, you have to go to prison for it. Are you kidding me? Now, with that said, I don't really care if they're consistent in that regard. Like if they start locking up developers of Monero, I still wouldn't agree with that, right? So sometimes the consistency isn't important, but it is hypocritical. And so I like to point it out.
There's just shy of $100 worth of Bitcoin hidden in this sponsor slot. This is my cold card, and this is how easy it is to set one up. I set up my PIN. I write it down because I'm a very responsible Bitcoiner. Then I make new seed words, and I'm going to do 12 words, generating. And then I'm going to write these words down because I'm a responsible Bitcoiner. The first word is off. The third word is erupt. The 10th word is crisp. That's all you get for now. But if you subscribe and follow me and watch the other videos, you might get the rest of those words, and you very might well just walk away with 150,000 sats. And of course, you can get your own cold card with my discount code BitcoinAudible. The links and details will be right in the show notes. Because this is how you responsibly hold your Bitcoin. Except, of course, that you never, ever, ever share your seed words. Ever. Don't do it. So, actually, I'm curious in the Roman case, actually, with Bitcoin Fog, is do you know what the sentence would be if he's found guilty, or have they done any sentencing? Because you said they're appealing it. I don't know exactly how the sequence of events occurs. What's the sort of sentencing for stuff like this?
So he was found guilty, and then the sentencing hadn't happened, and I honestly haven't looked into it. I would imagine it's already occurred. That usually comes after. And then I actually don't know the limits of it, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was, like 5 to 25 years, or I would just guess, I'd ballpark it. I mean, it's a significant amount of time. It wouldn't be like, like he was already in custody for a few years. I mean, that's like any amount of years is way too long, right? Yeah. But
you're measuring it in years is absurd. On top of the fact that it's ridiculous out the gate, like it's questionable from just a moral standpoint to begin with. Yeah. But yeah, it's crazy.
I've had suspects of forcible rape get like 6 years in prison where I'm at.
God, Jesus.
So keep that in mind.
God. And then like people for non-compliance on money transmission or running a website. It's so upside down. It's so upside down sometimes. I'm curious, give me a rundown of the thread, actually, that you posted on Noster, because I think this is a really important aspect that's a big step away from what Bitcoin Fog is, or what these, which is already questionable, but where is this being taken? And then I also want to get your take on like, where are all the sane people in this environment? Like aren't there's got to be a couple more people like you over there, and where the hell are they? But give me the breakdown of the kind of precedent and the situation with the Samourai guys and how it differs.
Yeah, sure. So with Samourai Wallet, it's so they're non-custodial, and so that means that if you're a user interacting with their service, during that entire process, you have control of your own private keys. So in my view, you control the Bitcoin and solely you. Like that's kind of how we determine like who controls the Bitcoin. It's like whoever controls the keys. And so the two men that were arrested didn't control any of the funds, didn't control the private keys, right? And so I can't see the argument to make that they were in custody of it. And so The complaint, it acknowledges that, right? That's not really a question. It's just that with the first charge, it's conspiracy to commit money laundering. And so conspiracy is a pretty big keyword. So if there was like a bank robbery and you have like, and this would vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but if you have like a bank robbery, the getaway driver might be like technically not one of the armed robbers, but he conspired with the armed robbers to commit that crime as a whole. And sometimes that doesn't matter. They just charge the getaway driver with the actual armed robbery. Kind of varies, but that's kind of the idea behind conspiracies. Like maybe you're not the person doing it. Like maybe you're not the person that's committing money laundering, but you certainly conspired with those folks to do it. And maybe, in this case, the conspiracy is this idea of like helping or facilitating, and they use specific adjectives, but that's kind of the idea, right? That they're aiding and helping this and allowing this to occur, even though you didn't necessarily have to use the actual app, right? There's, the Whirlpool specifically was built into other services. Other software could talk with their server, but that's sort of the idea, is that they conspired with these money launderers, these terrible money launderers that are out there. And so in the case that, they're going to, sometimes with conspiracy cases, you don't even need to prove that the underlying crime occurred, that you simply conspired with other people to do that underlying crime. Now, in this case, they're going to try to make that, because it's better with a jury to be like, hey, money laundering occurred, and it occurred from all these scary places like these dark web drug markets, right? They're gonna spin the crap out of it. If they can bring in child sexual abuse material stuff, they're gonna bring that in.
They will.
They're gonna do all sorts of stuff. If there was like a murder for hire plot and they have a case that shows that funds went through Whirlpool, they're gonna bring in that, right? And so they're gonna associate all this badness with money laundering, and they're going to and it'll be really easy. Like they're going to have actual federal cases, right? Maybe in just local ones where the funds very clearly went into Whirlpool. Like Whirlpool has a very distinct fingerprint on chain, right? And it's not going to be any surprise. That'll be easy to prove. But they'll have to prove that, that these two men that got arrested for this, the developers of Samourai Wallet, that they knew that they actually conspired, right? And so there's so many like analogies you can make with other services. like VPNs are good ones. Like everyone knows that cyber criminals will use a VPN. Like that's, if you're not, then you're like an amateur, right? And so, but these VPN services know that, right? But that's okay. Like that's just the nature of the product. Gun manufacturers know that some of their firearms may be used to commit crimes. Shocking, but that's okay. We're still going to encourage them to produce firearms. Like we're still, like there's still valid use cases for all this stuff. The idea that we have to, put these people in prison because someone might have misused their tool, and
that we would be held accountable for the worst people who may use what we create.
Right.
Like that I'm the one to be held accountable for somebody who uses like I'm trying to build an application. Like who could possibly build anything with any sort of control? What kind of apparatus would even be needed to even begin to see or control what other people do with it? It's not.
Yeah, and
they're the ones with the tool.
And the Samourai Wallet guys, like we all know that their online personalities were, a thing, and they certainly like would run their mouths, right? But
100%. Yeah.
I like that. I'm an American, right? I like honoriness. I like that kind of stuff. And so, that's definitely going to be used against them in their trial. Even though I would look at it and it's like, that doesn't necessarily, because that's going to go to their mindset. Like, look, they're talking about welcoming these sanctioned Russian people. Clearly, they developed their tool to circumvent sanction law. But I think an argument could easily be made that they're just running their mouths online, like it's just Twitter, right? Like, I have said if you looked at everything I've said online and some of the memes I've shared, you'd lock me up probably, right? Like, I think
Yeah.
we should cyberbully the ATF every day.
That's conspiracy to harass. 100,000% conspiracy to harass a federal agency.
Yeah, right. So, yeah, I mean, that's going to be used. So they did run their mouths. So if you compare that though to Wasabi Wallet, so Wasabi Wallet is very similar, but if you actually looked at like they probably called it their terms of service. It actually had a list of things that you were prohibited from doing with their service. And I don't think this will help. I mean, it'll help, but I don't think it'll like stop certain investigators from going after them potentially. But they would actually have a list, and I can't recall off the top of my head, but it was stuff like, proceeds from drug sales. I remember reading that if it had to do with like firearm sales, and I remember that because I remember being offended because I'm pretty extreme gun rights.
That's not a crime.
Advocate. Yeah. No, it's just like, so I remember that rubbed me the wrong way. So they have a list. So you could see how they're trying to cover their butts essentially. Like, hey, we don't want our service. And I'm not saying they didn't believe it, but it does make sense that generally folks don't want their service or their product to be used for, by criminals, like to facilitate criminal activity. Even if it's criminal activity, you don't, like, we might all kind of agree that it should be criminal and it's evil. Like child sexual abuse is a good example. Like if you find people that are advocating for that or sticking up for it, like it's a bad look. So, so that did kind of make them stick out a little bit compared to other mixers or mixing services. That kind of terminology, mixing, coin join, and tumbling, and that kind of stuff, it all kind of gets interchanged. But yeah.
I'm curious how you think what do you think the defense tactic is there? And also, like, with them basically declaring, I just can't imagine this holds up in court, but I don't know, crazier stuff has happened recently of the idea that they're money transmitters and they're money launderers, whether or not they have control over any of the funds. And I'm curious, how do you think the argument against that will be, or the argument for the defense from the conspiracy to commit money laundering, and then that any crime even occurred, even when we're just talking about the concept of compliance and money transmission, when they don't control any of it, like it just seems crazy to me.
Yeah. With that second charge, it's, this idea is that they're a money service business and they're not licensed and they didn't comply with all the rules that go along with a money service business, such as like KYC, collecting KYC on all your users and, complying with the travel rule and filing suspicious activity reports and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that second charge is pretty surprising in my opinion because that lack of custody. And so, the indictment talks about, they transferred the funds. They're a part of transferring the funds, and it has so many implications. With so many, like my mind immediately goes to the idea of all the threatening communication that could be considered a crime that exists out there, like with electronic harassment and that kind of stuff. That's all being done.
This is the conspiracy to do something, like they're being charged for that. The number of things, everything that transmits anything related to a crime immediately is culpable with this logic. Like, I don't know how you would possibly separate them.
Yeah. And, there is some historical precedent on this idea that can an internet service provider be held responsible for what you are viewing online? You might be viewing something that's super illegal, like child sexual abuse material. Yeah. So like, are these internet service providers, they're certainly facilitating in those, packets moving. Like, we obviously don't go after them. Right.
And that's literal transmission. It doesn't go. They're in custody of that data on its path to where it goes.
Think about like all the messaging services, Instagram, Facebook.
Yeah. Aren't they the getaway driver for every single fraud that's ever happened in a chat?
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, there's so much like illegal stuff that's moving around.
Yeah.
And, sometimes they take measures to fight that. Like there'll be, hashes of bad files and that will flag something, or there'll be keywords that people are saying, in their chats, and that might be scanned for, right? There's certain countermeasures sometimes that companies will do, and a lot of them would probably do it voluntarily, even if they weren't forced. And I actually don't know to what extent they are forced, but a lot of private companies, if they have a product or service, they're probably not wanting to be associated with like, this is what you do if you want to look at child sexual abuse material. They probably don't want that reputation, but yeah. So that's what's crazy about that. Yeah, the lack of custody of the funds has some crazy implications, and so that's and so I think the defense around that will be focused on that custody element and just using a ton of analogies like we've been mentioning, just because the implications just go crazy. And then with the other one, with the conspiracy to commit money laundering, again, I would focus on the fact that they didn't custody any funds. Technically, there's a lot of analogies of products being used of people using it to commit crime, but you don't hold the product developers responsible. There's the idea that like what the criminal mindset behind it, like what was their intent behind the service? Were they passionate about privacy? I would like focus on that. I would spin the thing is like these defendants will be able to explain themselves potentially. Usually it's not a good tactic for them to actually talk during their own trial, but this idea of some of the things they said that could be controversial, like welcoming sanctioned people or whatever else they might have said that could be mean, right? That might paint them in a bad picture to a jury and a judge. I would I said spin, but it might actually be, I don't really know. I'm just kind of guessing, like maybe they're just trying to be funny. Maybe that's part of their brand, because I can attest, like the Samourai Wallet guys, you didn't want them on your bad side. Like they would be mean to you, right? Like I know a lot of guys, a lot of folks that
they were Twitter assholes for sure.
I know a lot of folks that saw that they got arrested and they're like, you know what? They were assholes, but they shouldn't be locked up assholes. So even people that they weren't necessarily on friendly terms with are sympathetic, and so that's been good to see. But those are some of the defense tactics that I would see. I think that focusing on the funds, like the illicit funds moving through Whirlpool, I think that would be very easy to show did occur. I think there is something to say though about how much of those funds were illegal or illicit in the first place. See, I disagree with the premise that funds can be illegal in the first place. And so, but you're not going to really get very far with that, because the law very, very obviously disagrees with me. Like that is the beginning premise with money laundering law, is that there's funds that are illicit. There are funds that have come from something that's illegal, some sort of trade. Like most of it's the drug market, right? The war on drugs, but it could also be stolen funds. Those are probably the two bigger ones, or sanction evasions. Like the funds aren't illicit, but they're associated with a sanctioned person or company or country.
That one's just crazy to me, just because I think the idea of sanctions are like, it's just it's a form of aggression. It's saying that, like, because it's just saying that your rights are by permission.
Yeah. I mean, it's an example of a money system being weaponized by a country, right? Because the sanctions list is, it's the US OFAC. I mean, it's their list. So it's their weapon to yield. Yeah. But the idea that like how many of the funds going through Whirlpool can be considered illicit in the first place. And I think the number is really low. Like I've seen a few things online, haven't verified any of it, but it'll probably be very low as a percentage, I would guess. I have actually my funds still that I need. I mean, I say I need to move them, but Luckily, I had the keys, right? So I'm not really in a hurry, but I have some funds I can move that were tumbling around there. But in the whirlpool.
That's funny. That's crazy. I'm curious. Do you know of any other case where, like, I don't even know the precedent. I guess it's kind of moved in this environment for a lot, and it's probably happened more on the internet more recently. But do you know of any cases or any situations where, like, a platform has been culpable for what moved through it?
Yeah, kind of. So some of the things that come to mind are it doesn't have to do with funds though. It's like you have websites that are hosting and sharing and allowing you to download illegal material, like child sexual abuse material. So there are like websites that solely do that. And those are targeted by investigators all the time, right? And taken down and the kind of arguments that are being made are that, you're facilitating it. And in some cases, they would pay for new images to be submitted to the site. And so they're sort of encouraging children to be abused.
Go out and find,
right? And so those are like some of the arguments.
Supporting a market for it.
Yeah. I think that's a different situation to obviously the Whirlpool one. Because the Whirlpool one really is just funds being moved. What's their primary use case? Is it just privacy inducing? Like that's why I used it. Well, I also use it so I can see how it works, and that way I can also testify that I used it. But did they create that service, strictly for money laundering, for sanction evasions? I disagree with, even if that was their sole purpose, it's still think it's okay. But I don't think that's the case, right? Like I think they're really just they're very passionate about privacy, as most Bitcoiners are, and they're trying to fix a problem that Bitcoin has in regards to privacy. And they're doing it in a way that doesn't involve shitcoins, right? And there are examples of like decentralized things on shitcoin networks being targeted, but decentralized is kind of like blockchain. It's just like a term thrown around. It's like a buzzword, and it might not be, and it's questionable in regards to like, is it really decentralized? A lot of times it's not remotely. There's a website and a team of developers, and the website goes down and the whole service goes down. It's like, that's not. I don't think that meets the definition, the criteria.
I think that's kind of like one of the main points related to it.
Yeah, or the idea like it's a blockchain, but it's does it need to be on a blockchain? Like, can't you just have a server?
It is what it is. Do you know anything about, did Tornado Cash stop operating after the developer was that a situation? I realize I don't know much about the technical. You may not either.
I actually don't know as much about the Tornado Cash as I probably should. I actually I despise shitcoins so much that I have a hard time getting into reading about any of it. But the little I've heard about it is you'll read that it was non-custodial as well. And so you might say, well, that's some precedence, but it's like, that's still an ongoing case and it's still being fought, right? Like it's not case law for sure. And it's not even in this country, in the United States, but I don't know if it was technically non-custodial. I haven't looked into it. It certainly could be, but I'm usually skeptical when I hear that something's decentralized, and especially if it has to do with shitcoin stuff. And so I do remember reading something about messages that they allegedly seized from the developers where they're talking maybe to each other about appearing, about this idea of having custody or non-custody, and trying to something along the lines of, if you're communicating, make sure you don't like hint that we have custody, that kind of stuff. And I don't know if it's authentic or if I'm summarizing it correctly, but there's going to be, it's going to be certainly a huge element in that case, right? Like they're going to talk about it, undoubtedly. And it'll hopefully get fleshed out because, as a defense, hopefully you have your own experts you can bring in, right? And you can kind of test things and double check the work the investigators went through and whatnot. So yeah, I just don't know much about the Tornado Cash one. I had in my mind, like there's a clear difference between Bitcoin and everything else. And I just kind of like picture that crypto landscape as just this war-torn hellscape. And I'm just like, I'm fine over here. I'm fine with Bitcoin.
I'm curious, you mentioned earlier when you were just talking about like your period as a detective and stuff and running into, having to get warrants and submit subpoenas and all of these things to get information. And then you mentioned Bitcoin is just, and then you just check the blockchain. Kind of what's your take on privacy in Bitcoin? Like how much of a dangerous situation is Bitcoin in by getting the trade-off, like the incredible benefit, obviously, of the easily secured and verified monetary policy, but then the trade-off of having public exposure of a database of everybody's transactions.
Yeah.
How do you balance that? And like, kind of what's your take on like going into the future with that being as like this huge data source that you just don't have to have a warrant for,
right?
And the risks of that.
Yeah. So I've done quite a few trainings with prosecutors and law enforcement when I was a detective, and it would be on blockchain analysis and fraud cases in general. And I would always use them as opportunities to try to orange pill them. And so I would begin by explaining the traditional finance system, with like a slide deck. And, I focus on how regulated it is, how much it's surveillanced, how all the transactions are traceable. And we generally know like who's sending and who's receiving. And really the only exception to that is when you're cashing in or cashing out. And that's why there's a focus on cash, like with anti-money laundering laws, with like currency transaction reports and whatnot. And so if you basically so I would in these trainings focus on how crappy the traditional finance system is and how fragile it is, how much surveillance occurs there. And my goal was to make them uncomfortable, like, because that's the financial system that the audience is participating in, right? And in order to, I basically focus like all these ledgers are centrally controlled, right? Your account at Wells Fargo, they have that ledger. Wells Fargo manages it. They have a ledger, they have a balance with the ledger with the central bank. I would call it the central bank, United States Central Bank, because it sounds worse than the Federal Reserve. Because you have a lot, especially cops, a lot of them want to be perceived.
That's what it is. Yeah.
A lot of them want to be perceived as like constitutional focused, right? And they want to be perceived as like not Gestapo, right? A lot of them. And so I would just frame the traditional financial system in a true light, in my opinion. And then I would talk about like, and when we have crimes occur on that, really these anti-money laundering laws are really just adding steps for the bad guys to navigate through. They're still avoiding the thresholds. They're still moving money. The money moves really quick, and it's fragile in the regards that you can kind of claw it back a lot of times, but there's still loss usually in the end, and someone's out money in the end. And then I would transition to that from that, and also with one of the fragile things about the traditional financial system in terms of financial crime investigations is because these ledgers are all centralized, I can't view them, which is good. But in order for me to view them as an investigator, I have to issue a subpoena or a court order and receive the information from the company. And so that logistically is like me getting the subpoena. That's a few hours. And that's really fast for an investigator. Usually it's because it involves going to someone else. You're not writing your own subpoena or signing your own subpoena rather. And so, you have to get it, you have to issue it. And usually it's email, but sometimes you have to physically go to a branch and like present it. It's awful. And then it takes time for someone to read it and process it and gather the data and then send it back to you, hopefully by email. And yeah, that might be a few days to a few months. And like the funds have gone, right? The funds have definitely moved faster than that. And so it's a tedious process if you're trying to solve a crime. You'll get the data eventually, the records, but it's going to take time and it sucks. And you're going to be slow at it.
And then not until you look at it do you even know the next bank or next institution that you're going to have to subpoena or get information on. And so you have to go through all of that, whereas they might have moved it to 5 different institutions in the middle of a day.
Exactly. Yeah, and they'll do that, and then you'll always be like a few months behind. If they've moved it a lot.
Yeah.
And then if you compare that to Bitcoin, you'll probably begin with, here's my address, here's my transaction hash, and usually it's in the context of someone told me to send all this Bitcoin to them, and they got scammed. And so your starting point is a transaction. If you just look on the blockchain and you can follow the flow of funds, right? That's the beauty of it in terms of, that's good if you're trying to solve a crime. And you just trace it. And usually these bad guys are trying to cash out, right? If you're not cashing out, then your threat vector is way smaller. Like if anything, like really, like
it's always at the edge. Yeah.
A lot of these, the bad actors are trying to cash out. They're not Bitcoiners. They're just using it as a tool.
They don't give a shit. They're just, it's a tool.
Their theft. So that's kind of neat to see. I would focus on the idea, because I'd have to explain the Bitcoin network and show how it's different from the other one. And I would really emphasize this idea that it is secure, right? Like this idea, because in the traditional financial system, we can send a freeze request to a banking institution and say, hey, this guy's account, we need to freeze it. And, for X, Y, Z reasons. And then we're going to apply for a search warrant to seize it later. And then you can do that and you can seize the funds. And maybe the funds are, in my case, like I would only seize funds if they were, they didn't belong to them. They were the stolen money that I'm following, the stolen funds that I'm following.
Trying to get it back to the grandma.
Exactly. Yeah. Or someone stole your bike and they have it in their garage. Like, I'm going to write a search warrant for that guy's house for that bike because it's stolen property. Right. So it's kind of that kind of idea. And so, seizing funds from traditional financial institutions is easy. But if you're remaining on the Bitcoin network and you're in custody, it's really just who controls the private keys, right? Maybe it's a centralized exchange. In that case, it's just like the bank, and you can send a freeze request and seize the funds. Assuming they're they're responsive to law enforcement requests. But if you're hanging out on the Bitcoin network and you have custody of your private keys, it's not seizable. It's great, and I would focus on that. And I would really drive home that point. And that's, if you're like a investigator new to cryptocurrencies in general, that's just like a eye-opening thing to learn about, is this idea that something is unseizable if you hold it in the correct way. And then really, your threat is cashing out. Like, are you sending to a centralized exchange and cashing out? Then, you have to be careful. That's a potential issue if you're trying to sell your Bitcoin for whatever reason. I don't know why you would, but
well, you stole it, so you don't even know what it's worth.
Yeah, a lot of my stories involve this assumption that you stole it in the first place, but you could always. There's definitely like folks that will need to cash it because they're freedom fighters and some god-awful place, and they just need
literally just trying to get them resources, for crying out loud. Like all the stuff that happened with the trucker convoy and everything. Just what a mess.
Absolutely. So so I would in my trainings I would really focus on that kind of stuff and try to orange pill them, just like, hey, this is the system you're living under that you're probably using for your own personal finances, and it's shit. And then here's this network
that's a great opportunity.
It was fun.
They just sat them in front of you. It's like, all right,
I would show them the BitNodes map where it's the globe and you have all the Bitcoin full nodes that are publicly broadcasting. And it's just like, I'd be like, hey, if you want to kill the networks, you got to get rid of all these dots on this map. And then I would usually point out at that point, like at my sheriff's office at the time, there was a Bitcoin full node running on my desktop. And
Nice.
so it's like, you never know where one is. It could be like your little Raspberry Pi on a battery powered source connected to Wi-Fi in a closet somewhere, right? Like you can't defeat this thing. Like this is a monster that you cannot defeat.
I don't even know how many are in this house anymore. Like,
yeah. So yeah, I try to do like Bitcoin's overwhelming. It's going to win. This is how you can interact with it in the meantime. And you should think about doing it yourself. And so that's kind of how I would do it. But
that's a great lesson.
Yeah, and obviously I would usually frame this idea of mixing as a privacy thing. Coin joins is a privacy thing. It's not a negative thing. But it's something to consider if you're investigating financial crime sometimes.
This is the Swan Bitcoin app, and this is how easy it is to just buy Bitcoin whenever you're feeling like it. And I feel like it right now. And as it shows me right here, I still have $9,388 worth of my $10,000 of Bitcoin buying that has no fees whatsoever. And now I have $10 more worth of Bitcoin. I do this quite often. One of the really great things about Swan is the incredible number of resources they have for learning and understanding anything that you want to know about Bitcoin. And importantly, they're going to teach you why you should not trade. They're not going to encourage you to trade. They are Bitcoin only. If you're looking for an easy and reliable way to get into Bitcoin, if you're looking to put Bitcoin in your IRA, if you're looking to put Bitcoin in your business, if you're looking to do anything around getting on a Bitcoin standard or getting exposed to Bitcoin in your portfolio, check out swanbitcoin.com/guy is my special link, and you will find it very conveniently right in the show notes. So you actually brought that up, and I don't think I've really addressed this specifically on the show, but you specifically labeled the semantic, that there was a semantic difference and we're conflating coin joining, mixing, and just like privacy in general. So maybe actually give me that distinction for just me and the audience for what those mean exactly.
Yeah, I mean, it will kind of vary depending on it will vary certainly, because there's different services and apps that have been designed where they're using they'll have Tumblr or Mixer or something in their title, right? But the idea behind a coin join is like a coordinated spend. There's all these different terms, right? And I would in my trainings usually just list a lot of them and then just explain like what they're doing and how they might vary. And so usually like with like a criminal case, you're going to have definitions that you're going to lay out as like an investigator or as an attorney, and you're just going to use those definitions, and hopefully you can agree on them with your defense like in the time of trial. But what you're usually trying to do with these services, you're trying to break certain heuristics, and heuristics is like a cool fancy word that we use instead of the word assumption. And so they are assumptions, but you make assumptions all the time. And so, heuristics just sounds cooler. So that's kind of the industry standard to use. It's more scientific, I think. But you have these different heuristics, and you're trying to make them not as reliable, right? With these different techniques. And so the most common one is just coordinating with other people or yourself. You're trying to coordinate with others in order to create a transaction on the Bitcoin blockchain where all the inputs in that transaction are not just you, right? Because usually with a typical transaction, you're creating it with whatever UTXOs you have, and maybe you can choose which ones you're using. Maybe you can't. Maybe your wallet's just going to determine it based on the amount you're trying to send. And because that's usually how people are interacting with the network, there's some assumptions made when you look at a Bitcoin transaction that is called the common input heuristic, where all the inputs used in that transaction are going to be assumed to be the same owner. What I usually focus on is it's either the same owner or there was some sort of coordination that occurred and you don't really know. And that's the accurate way to describe it. I have no idea on numbers, but I would say most transactions are not coordinated, right? But it kind of depends. if you have software that allows you to coordinate with others more automatically or more easily, that's cool. Those are good. Those are cool techniques. You and I could technically coordinate with the right wallet software.
Yeah.
And we could
just use a pay join. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So there's like coordinated spending where you're just sending yourself. You could be sending to someone else. You could be making a payment to someone, and you're using some of their inputs and some of their outputs to you're coordinating with that person that is receiving the payment, and using some of their funds that they have accessible to confuse it, right? And so ultimately, like with blockchain analysis, you're looking at transactions and you're trying to come up with a story of what these funds are doing. And so sometimes it's really easy where you're like, okay, this is a withdrawal from an exchange. You can see like these are all definitely addresses and inputs that belong to the exchange. And then all of these outputs are just different users, and maybe one of them or two of them will be outputs. They go right back to their change, right? They're going right back to the exchange, and then you can look at those outputs, and if you're probably just like following just one of them is like your primary interest, and then you're going to look at it and be like, well, what address does that belong to? Does it have other history? What does it do with those funds? And there's certain things you can there's certain patterns you can see, there's wallets where you're sweeping funds, and then there's certain, you're trying to, basically the name of the game is like, is this wallet ever making a payment to someone else? Are these funds changing hands? And if they're changing hands, which ones are which one is the change address, right? So that's kind of the name of the game, is like, when do the funds change hands, when they don't? And a lot of times you don't know the answer, right? You see a withdrawal from an exchange, you're following the flow of funds, they hop, or they move a few times, and maybe you can make some assumptions on them, and then you can see that the funds go into another exchange, and then you hit up that exchange with a subpoena, right? And you're like, hey, who controls this account? Who controls this deposit address? And maybe it's the same as, maybe that matches something else you already have, right? Like there's going to be other information they have, like with the device, the IP, all sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
The KYC documents, presumably. And so sometimes you can answer what happened on chain, or make really strong assumptions of what happened on chain, because what happened. You have a starting point with starting leads, and then you have an endpoint with all sorts of leads, and sometimes they correlate. And so there's a lot of that kind of stuff going on, where you're making assumptions, but then your assumptions kind of get proven right or wrong, depending on what information you provide. Because with these assumptions, like in order to issue a subpoena and get more information, you don't need like probable cause. You don't need to know, more likely than not, that this person, that these funds are the funds I'm tracing, right? You're not working in those, and probable cause is more likely than not. And then at the trial side of it, you're beyond a reasonable doubt. So you're not working in those realms. You're working in, it's likely to be relevant in a law enforcement inquiry, right? It's like, it's very, so sometimes you're making assumptions and you have like maybe two flows, two paths to follow, and you're just going to subpoena both ends.
And you trace both of them.
Yeah. Some of these ideas of, I'm tricking investigators, it's like, yeah, you're not, you're just adding a couple steps to the investigation maybe. But again, even in this example I gave you, there's a cash out part of it, right? So if you just withdraw from an exchange and it's to an address you control, it's not going to be seizable, if you secure your private keys in a certain way. And really the only assumption we can make is that, maybe you withdrew to cold storage and you still own those funds, and then maybe you lost those keys, or maybe you say, no, I bought a truck and that was a payment for a truck, or I bought some consulting advice and that was payment for the advice, whatever. So there's stories that investigators will assume, and then maybe that story will get informed by whatever the defendant or person you're investigating, gives you. Or maybe you find evidence of they wrote it down what they were doing. That happens sometimes.
That's that's actually pretty funny, but
Yeah.
yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah, cloud storage.
Trying to keep a record of what's going on. Yeah.
Yeah, cloud storage. It's seasonable, guys.
um, did you actually do like how often would something like Bitcoin show up, and did you actually do uh like your own kind of analysis, follow your own heuristics, and or did you outsource that? Like, did you actually ever work with Chainalysis and have to ask them to try to unravel something, or any other companies? I know there are other companies that are doing that as well.
Yeah.
Like, what's kind of the space there, and was that ever even relevant to what you did?
It would never come up in like major crime stuff or homicide stuff. I never had to touch that. That was more the Google records and Apple records and cell phone provider stuff, that kind of angle of cybercrime.
Mm-hmm.
And then the blockchain analysis that would come up like easily half the cases of fraud. And
oh wow,
a lot of the fraud I saw was people from the suspects would often be like in Nigeria or India, like a foreign country. They're interacting with our local folks through Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp, phone, like, think VoIP phone numbers usually. Google Voice they would use a lot, like a bunch of amateurs. They'd have emails. They'd have like websites, right? That they're incorporating in their scams and schemes sometimes. Facebook Marketplace, that kind of stuff. And so they're trying to like steal money from folks in America, and they're tricking them. And then a lot of times, if they can get that money into Bitcoin, it's just like a lot easier to get the funds to you. And then they would take that Bitcoin and usually move it into an exchange like Remitano or Binance, usually Paxful, like those kind of exchanges. They're a lot of times, man, they're using their own identity with those accounts. But, they're probably imagining like, hey, I'm in New Delhi and I just stole $7,000 from an old lady, where Travis works. Like the chances of like someone going to New Delhi and holding you accountable is probably not high. But I had a hard time like letting those cases go because they're easily solvable. And so I would look into them. And then when I started doing the blockchain analysis initially, I didn't have any tools, man. I would use like Wallet Explorer and like a few block explorers that would kind of inform you about stuff. And so Wallet Explorer, it will cluster things for you depending on certain heuristics. I also found out that they actually track IP addresses for people that look at certain addresses, and they'll try to associate that IP address access with that address. And so they'll collect that kind of data.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I don't know how often that would come into something, but I could definitely see it happening. It's kind of like the idea of a tracking number for FedEx, right?
Yeah.
Like if you're mailing something to a suspect and you give them a tracking number, who's going to look that tracking number up? The suspect, right? And so you can do all sorts of tricks like that where you can figure out where they're logging in from, right? So it's kind of that idea. So I would use Excel spreadsheets, and I would like create my own stuff in that, and I would like make my own assumptions based on heuristics that made sense to me at the time. Like common input's an easy one, but like round number inputs, like with the Bitcoin value, with the USD equivalent at the time, sometimes too. And you're just making assumptions and trying to figure out where did the money go, where did the funds go. And I would make flow charts on like Microsoft Paint and just do that. And then
that's awesome.
I eventually found the blockchain surveillance kind of companies, right? So there's a ton of them. There's probably like a dozen of them, and I've used almost all the tools. I would play around with those tools a lot. And there's some that are like really good, and they're good, showing the flow of funds, analyzing it. They're really good at clustering stuff on with certain heuristics, and they'll tell you the heuristic sometimes, and sometimes they have IP addresses associated with transactions or addresses. They're making some assumptions on those IP addresses, but there's all sorts of commercial tools out there for private companies to get, private investigators to use, obviously government agencies will use them. Sometimes they'll use a couple of them because sometimes they're different. Sometimes they have different styles. Actually, one of my favorites, which is no longer live, is OXT Explorer, OXT.me. That was my go-to, even when I was a detective. They did have a terms of service, though, that said that if you're law enforcement, you weren't allowed to use it. But
that's
I'm
funny.
an honorary American, man. I wasn't listening. So I always thought, they'd probably be okay.
Bitcoiner first.
Private property. I'm trying to preserve private property rights, right? Like, I think they'd be okay with it, but I didn't ask for permission. I gave them a lot of attribution. I submitted a lot of attribution myself to them. But so that's the other thing, right? Like, these companies will have attribution. In other words, they'll know that certain addresses they're owned by the private keys to those addresses are owned by these entities, and so they'll have that kind of data. And a lot of that's because they service those companies. A lot of it they'll buy them the data. A lot of it's just it's easy to detect. Like, they'll interact with the service, and it's like, oh, okay, Coinbase just gave me this deposit address, and we'll put it in there. And then if whatever they spend with, based on the common input heuristic, we're going to cluster those all with Coinbase because they're going to move funds around and, for their own accounting reasons and treasury reasons, and they're going to have file wallets and cold wallets, all that, right? And so it's really easy to cluster exchanges usually. And so, if you're really going to do blockchain analysis, it's a huge advantage to use these commercial tools for attribution. But OXT was really good because it would follow the UTXO, and that's what I was interested in, right? But there are all sorts of weird methodologies you have to consider about. Like, if you have a group of scammers using one wallet to receive all their victims' funds, and they have like a team working, they might all be using like different addresses of the same wallet, but none of them own it, right? It's like some team leader that has it, right? And so then they might get a cut of whatever they stole. And so it would be, sometimes it's interesting because you have a lot of victim funds pooling together in a wallet that maybe you can cluster together. And then, like, which funds that are outgoing are your victim's funds? Because I would like just be focused on my victim from my jurisdiction. And so usually I would try to focus on like the UTXO, but sometimes you have these tools that they don't really show the UTXO. They're more, they kind of turn the Bitcoin blockchain into a account based sort of, like, these are the incoming funds, these are outgoing funds.
Oh yeah.
And sometimes it's kind of important to see because it's like, hey, I'm following 2 Bitcoins and they send 2 Bitcoins out in this particular transaction, but maybe it's not the UTXOs that I was following technically.
Yeah.
But that's like, I'm trying to figure out the specific guy that scammed my victim, right? Because if I'm trying
That's interesting that it wouldn't be UTXO based more broadly, that they would actually try to, make the assumption about an account. Like, I can understand like that as being like a view, like that you could use that assumption in order to try to build that out. But it's like the UTXO is the thing that you're hunting down.
Yeah, and their tools are definitely aware of it, but I think it's more of just a graphical user interface, kind of the view, like you said.
I guess they're expecting the user to not necessarily know all of those details, so they're trying to obscure it. Yeah,
exactly. It's not you're not really informing the user as much as I thought. So I really liked OXT. I would use it with some of the commercial tools that I had access to. I really enjoyed TRM Labs' tool. They were my favorite. And then, a lot of it's just like, a lot of it came down to like, it's really, really pretty flowcharts that juries and judges and attorneys can read and understand. Like, a lot of it just boils down to that.
Oh my God.
Because you're trying to like you and I, we're nerds. We might look at this and be like, okay, I know exactly what happened to these funds. But then it's another thing to be like, all right, now I have a farmer from my community that's 65 years old, and he's never heard of Bitcoin. And I need to explain how I know this guy stole his neighbor's money, right? So that's kind of, so I did definitely like level up my game, and I went through a lot of trainings and stuff on blockchain analysis and demixing kind of stuff, and learned all about the heuristics, and ended up being a trainer and a lot of stuff. But by the time I was a trainer, I was very libertarian, right? And so I would just be mindful of that and try to focus on the thing with blockchain tracing, blockchain analysis, heuristics. None of it's secret, really, right? Like everyone understands the implications of it, and they understand that these are assumptions that are going to be used in court sometimes. Even the folks that are building the privacy tools, right? Like we understand all of that. So it's not really a secret. Like it's out there.
Are you excuse me. Are you hopeful about the legal environment and about the potential to push back against this and actually get some sort of sensible framework in place that actually makes the legal environment not just something that I just read a piece by Francis Pouillot the other day on like just it's crazy toxic to deal with Americans because you just don't know, like this idea that you could be in Spain or in Russia and then be held accountable for money transmission, like regulatory compliance, because you had somebody in the US using your wallet or your service or something. Like that just spells disaster for the variety and just the ability for the market to provide any sort of services for like talk about like getting behind, so are you kind of hopeful about that?
So with American law, I'm not really hopeful.
Yeah.
I'm pretty black-pilled on politics. But I'm definitely optimistic still because I think that there will be a lot of freedom technology that just allows you to opt out or that just allows you to not comply in a way that allows you to get away with it. I think that's the way to go. Freedom technology is definitely the way to go. And then there's a whole industry around anti-money laundering and this money service business kind of stuff, and the Department of Treasury and FinCEN. I mean, there's this giant gaggle that's going to be pushing this stuff, and they're just not going to go away. And so I'm not hopeful. And it's really extra annoying because I am an American and I live in America. And the more you learn about this stuff, the more you go into it, you just see how much the federal government is trying to control and how much damage they're willing to do to other people in other countries and foreigners and Americans alike in order to maintain this control and all in the name of like protecting the consumer and protecting you. It's just like it's so twisted. It's so twisted. I'd rather, I mean, I'm like an anarcho-capitalist at this point though, right? I'd rather have no interference in actual free markets. And I want any sort of anti-fraud or KYC stuff to just appear naturally. Like maybe you want to have a reputation of security and, we're going to take care of we're going to custody your funds and we're going to protect your funds from fraud and identity theft and whatnot or whatever, right? And I think that there would be a market for that. I think there would be a market for like, hey, we focus on your privacy and we're not going to KYC you, but we're also not going to help you if your account gets taken over because we have no way of verifying that you're really you. There's some downsides.
That just makes us literally helping in the fraud potentially. Yeah.
Well, and if you're a user or a customer and you're aware of what service you're signing on to, I think that's fine. I think consumers can learn about those risks themselves. They can choose, right? They can opt in, right? Consent. Like they should be able to opt into whatever service they're using, whatever company they're using. Right now, that's not the field we're playing in, right? Like all the products and services in America have to do like the same thing. They have to comply. There's these huge barriers too. I mean, if you're trying to be a money service business or money transmitter, you suddenly have to have teams, compliance teams,
it's crazy,
or hire it out,
crazy.
Right? It's just expensive. But there is an element of all that where, if you are accepting funds and they're fiat funds, it's so fragile. People are going to definitely scam you. Like if you're accepting, debit card transactions, like people will use debit cards that they don't technically own, and there will be returns and chargebacks and reversals and wire recalls and all sorts of stuff that you're gonna have to deal with. because there's
Mm-hmm.
actual fraudsters that are out there that will try to screw your company over. And so that's something to keep in mind if you, if you were to operate it in an unregulated way or something. If we're picturing some scenario where there wasn't any anti-fraud, what I'm getting at is like there's certain things that I think anti-fraud measures that would occur naturally in a free market, but
Yeah. That's not quite what we've got.
not quite.
Interesting that you bring it up in the context of like there's kind of a huge industry. Like there's regulatory agencies, there's all sorts of people who have made it their job, their position, their role in enforcing this stuff and to get more things under their purview. And there's kind of like this whole it's a bit of a regulatory industrial complex that doesn't want regulations to go away because it's their job, it's their livelihoods.
Right.
And so it's got this feedback loop of the more power and kind of influence that they have, the more they can make everything fall under their regulatory umbrella and force an absurd amount of just friction and compliance on everything and anything that they can possibly get underneath their thumb. And that's good for them. That's like extremely beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's, I've talked to a lot of folks in that area, gone to a lot of conferences and stuff. And sometimes you can tell they've never thought about an alternative.
Wow.
Like when you're raising financial privacy
Wow.
concerns, they're just like they just hasn't crossed their mind. With that said, you'd be surprised sometimes, like if you talk about it often enough. And I've met folks, I still have friends that work in a variety of agencies and companies.
Mm-hmm.
And every now and then one of them will reach out to me and they're like, hey, they kind of like see the light. Like,
yeah.
Maybe the memes got to them. I don't know. The Bitcoin content gets to them, but sometimes there is hope for some individuals, right? You can convince folks. Like I've met. When I first started as a law enforcement, I was. I remember like investigating drug cases, and I don't like drugs, but I realized that outlawing an entire market, like being a prohibitionist, essentially, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah,
and it's not useful. Yeah. It's not useful in the war against drugs to really, we're not winning that. But I remember like investigating crimes and thinking I was doing the right thing, thinking I was doing the good thing, that I was fighting bad guys, right? And I remember a few people went to prison, for some of my cases, and because they had gotten in trouble long enough, often enough for drug related stuff, and I could like look at it and be like, yeah, those guys were bad guys. They're committing other crimes. But, I couldn't help but like in hindsight, look back and think, like you do, especially if you're in a small community, you will see their family suffer, right? Like they're in prison.
Yeah.
Dad's gone, husband's gone. It's kind of like the idea that you have drug problems and you have to lock people up in order to solve that, and the impact on families as well in that regard is crazy to me now. But I remember a time where I agreed with that and I thought that was the right thing to do. And so talking with a lot of investigators, regulators, attorneys, they are starting with this premise that the war on drugs is a good, righteous cause. These cartels need to be stopped. There's child sexual abuse material that's rampant and people are buying it, and we need to protect the kids. There's human trafficking occurring, and we need to stop the funds from moving to that, I guess, right? There's Russians are crazy and we can't have them moving money, whatever, what have you, right?
Yeah.
Like there's always terrorism, right? Like terrorism and safety and fighting crime is always going to be the excuse. And they can be right sometimes. Like you do solve crimes occasionally with KYC, and regulation, and some of these rules do allow you to solve some crime sometimes, but is it really worth it? Right? That's another question entirely.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you look into it more, like I've looked into it enough where it's like, yeah, I'd rather not have any of that, at least forced. Again, if it's spawned naturally in the free market, then, go forth, and
Yeah.
you'll either be successful or you'll go bankrupt, right? Like, I think that's how it should
Yeah.
be. But that's not what's
Yeah.
really happening right now. You have all these private companies conducting surveillance, and maybe they want to do that, maybe they don't. And then those records are, and that data is available upon request by government. And the request might be like a search warrant, right, or a subpoena or court order. But or in some regards, the agencies will just retire folks, and they'll go to work for those companies, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Well, that's a little bit reassuring that, you know, maybe some people are still figuring it out. I mean, I don't want to use up an unbelievable amount of your time. You've been very gracious, and thank you for coming on the show. But I do want to just ask, I'm curious your thoughts for like whether or not people should be like Bitcoiners who are listening to this show, who do have the right perspective, who do have that, you know, they see that ethical, those questionably ethical things. Like, do you think it's actually smart to go into law enforcement to try to be a force against that, to go into the legal system, you know, to participate in politics? Like, you know, like, is the solution to expand out and try to be in that environment, or do you think it's like to remove ourselves from those places where we're in like put in questionable situations or forced to make bad decisions, and you know, continue to try to develop these tools? Like what do you think that right path is? I mean, you left law enforcement because you felt it was going bad, and now you want to devote to Bitcoin. You know, like clearly I 100% assume that you think that that was the right choice, right? That you're doing better because you're working with Bitcoin and you're trying to expand Bitcoin more specifically, which you already kind of did in teaching people about, you know, in the courses. But
Right.
so kind of what's your thoughts on the big picture there, you know? Like,
Yeah. I mean, I just became like one of those psychopaths that just couldn't stop thinking about Bitcoin. Like, I would be doing some sort of blockchain analysis at my desk, and then we get a
yeah.
call. It's like, hey, someone got murdered. And I'd be like, fuck. Like, I'm getting pulled away from like the stuff I want to do, but very inconsiderate murderers out there sometimes. But no, so the tracing's fun and stuff, but
Mhm.
it's if you got a career or a job in those like fields that sometimes have bad reputations, like you'll have the opportunity certainly to do good work where you're helping real victims, and it's righteous, in my opinion.
Mhm.
Obviously I value like private property rights, right? And you'll have an opportunity to like to protect that, right? I think that there is definitely like a need for a service that involves investigations of private property loss, of
Yeah.
real crimes,
For
right?
sure.
And so there is a
Yeah.
market for that sort of service, and we sort of socialized it in the United States, where we have law enforcement agents that do that perform that function, pay with taxes, and so that sucks, right? And we can like complain about it, but I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon. But if you want to participate in that stuff, you'll definitely learn like good skills, and you'll have an opportunity to do good things. You'll save lives potentially, right? There's some
Mhm.
opportunity there. There's so many different types in these industries that you could easily find like a like-minded agency that will allow you to not violate your principles, right?
Mhm.
And maybe that's getting harder, maybe that's getting easier. I'm not really sure, right? And maybe you can
Mhm.
like fight for change. I don't know. There's a lot of investigators I met that were Bitcoiners that just didn't want to work in Bitcoin all the time, right? It's like a hobby, but they're
Huh.
not
Okay. Yeah.
they're not
Yeah.
that psychopathic as me, right? And
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
so, or maybe they didn't have like skill sets that could they could leverage in the Bitcoin space that might be applicable. And so I know a few guys that work in law enforcement, parole, and probation that are eager to work in Bitcoin, but they're not really sure what skill sets they currently have that can be utilized there.
like how to do that. Yeah,
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 or they don't necessarily want to start over. Maybe like they have a pension, they have
yeah,
they're making more money now,
yeah,
that kind of thing. So I think it's still I wouldn't necessarily say like don't do it because like you have the ability to do good and be principled still. Um, and yeah, the route I went is not necessarily for everyone for sure, but I think that if you're just like called to work in Bitcoin, I think you won't be satisfied with your life until you do it, and I think you'll make it happen.
yeah,
Right.
yeah. Yeah, I know about that.
I mentioned that I'm black pilled on politics. Like I'm just black pilled on politics in America in general. But like the more I've just gone down the like ANCAP rabbit hole, it's kind of like the more you realize how many violations are occurring all
Yeah,
the
yeah.
time, and how much of and a lot of it though I think is caused by the fiat system. Um, like even my own little tiny city here, I'm a city council here. I mean, there's so much like money that the state and the federal government just throw at these little tiny towns. And you can say no and be principled. And I actually do, but I am always outvoted. But it's,
Yeah.
they just throw all this fake government money around and you can spend it, on your city and you can like make the principled stance to not accept it. But you're just saying no to millions and you're, eventually they'll ask you for stuff, right? Like FEMA will ask for you to pass, certain laws and all sorts of BS like that. And
It's leverage.
yeah,
Yeah.
and then everything costs so much. Like, so if you want to upgrade your like water system or something, like it's so much money now. Like if you want to put a new well
Yeah.
in for your city, it's like so much money that it's essentially forcing you to go get grants and go get these help from the state and federal governments, right? And so it's just all kind of the fiat system just makes everything so much worse that a lot of the
Yeah.
counters to those problems are like government solutions. And if you're like me, you don't like it because the government solution means it's not really, I mean, it's not, the government solution is like going to work outside of the free market.
Yeah.
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 So that's kind of where my opinion is on that. Even with that said, I still like happily talk with cops and lawyers and regulators because I think that it's healthy to talk about privacy. It's healthy to talk about anti-money laundering stuff. And if you can
Hmm.
get them thinking, I think that's good. Maybe you're not going to be successful in the long run, but I mean, I've had folks from like Chainalysis and I've had FBI agents like I've talked with, those kind of folks and you'd be surprised how many like-minded people exist in those organizations. Um, and sometimes they're only involved with the really bad stuff. Bad stuff in
Hmm.
regards to terrorism, like real terrorism, or child
Yeah.
sexual abuse material cases. Like that's all they're focused on. So they're like, I'm doing good, I'm doing righteous work, and maybe my
Hmm.
organization or business on a whole does some like shady stuff or stuff that's questionable. But that's kind of how I looked at law enforcement in general. It's like I don't like doing traffic stops. I think it's kind of predatory, like lurking on the side of the road.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
I'm not going to do it, right? I'm just going to sit behind a computer and do my nerdy stuff. But um, it is more satisfying working at Bitcoin. But I think it's only for, I think you have to have that calling, right? Which just happened to a lot of folks, it seems.
Yeah. Yeah. Loved. I just noticed the book behind you on the shelf, the Anarchist Handbook.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Um,
Michael's the man.
yeah,
He
he is.
radicalized me. If you ever meet him, tell him that he
Nice.
radicalized me, and
Nice.
I stopped being a cop.
Hell yeah. Hell yeah. Dude, I would love to have a conversation with Michael Malice, man.
Privatized law enforcement for sure. I think you'd be able to do less though, right? Because you'd be culpable for whatever you're doing.
Yeah.
There's certain things you wouldn't be able to
No.
do, but
No, that's always interesting to just kind of like unpack that and like what that would like. It's who was it that did defending the indefensible?
I've heard that, but I don't know what it's referencing.
Oh my god, it's just talking about like all the edge cases of like prostitution. It's like
Oh,
how do you
right.
defend the things that are people think of as like ethically bad, but then shouldn't be crimes still, you
Yeah.
know? Um,
Yeah. Yeah, I understand that.
yeah. Um, but yeah, I just want to say again, thanks for coming on the show, man. This was a fascinating conversation, and such a weird environment that we're in. And I think a couple of the cases that are started right now, how long actually I guess Tornado Cash has been like 2 years already?
Yeah, it can take years. I mean, you get indicted,
yeah.
you get you're going to have an opportunity to like go find
It's gonna go on
lawyers that you
forever.
want, right? And
Yeah.
you have to have the opportunity to build your defense, right? So
Mm-hmm.
almost everyone will say they're not guilty at the beginning because they need to. They might not even have like their own attorney yet, right? Like they're sometimes that changes, and you need a chance to really look at all the evidence that's being presented against you, and it could take a long time. You need to find all your expert witnesses and your defense team. You know, the folks that are experts that might be able to help you out and look at the evidence that the government's using against you. So, and then they usually talk about deals, usually.
Mm-hmm.
And then if it goes to trial, you know, it could be years down the road. So,
yeah, it's gonna be a long time, but it'll be interesting to follow what comes of these cases and what it means for the U.S. market. I think the U.S. market will probably be in a whole bunch of like people will be scared of operating in the U.S. for probably a good while because
yeah,
even without verdicts on this stuff, they'll probably just be overly cautious and avoid the market altogether. And it may be until those cases are done that some of them actually start showing back up again,
Yeah, certainly. I mean, right now we know that like the investigators involved in this and the attorneys see eye to eye, right? They're like, okay, we think we have a case, but that's really the only opinion we have so far. The judge will look like, is there probable cause? Initially it's like, okay, yeah, there probably is, and then it'll get fleshed out, legally. But it's kind of like it's the government going to trial against defendant, but it's the government that's overseeing the trial, right? So this idea, I'm always skeptical about this idea of the government holding itself accountable. And yeah, they're different branches, but like you can roll your eyes pretty easy at that idea.
I call bullshit. I call bullshit.
Yeah. So
all right. Well, hell yeah, dude. Why don't you share with everyone like how to follow you, how to stay up on this stuff? Like, what are you following? Have you actually had any contact with any of these guys? Like, how should people go about staying up on this and then staying up with you?
Gotcha. Yeah. I mean, I'm only on Noster, but and I don't really post. I don't really post content. I might, if folks have a appetite for it, but I'm not in contact with the guys that got the Samourai Wallet developers at all. But I'm interested in personally donating to them. So when I learn about how they're doing that, and I think it'll take a while, right? They're going to want a defense team, and they're attorneys, and they're going to want to make sure that's all done in a sound way. But that will definitely happen, right? This is going to be a big case, and then once I learn that, I'm going to share the crap out of it, right? I'm going to encourage folks to donate to. I think it'll be an important case. But I'm on Noster, and then the only other thing really I have going on is at the Nashville conference with the Bitcoin conference, we have a section of that with the Bitcoin veterans, and I'll be doing a workshop. I'm not sure if it's on which day or if it's on both days of the conference, but there'll be a workshop in that area of the Bitcoin veterans that I'll be doing that's about chain surveilling yourself. And so I'll include like tips and techniques and considerations you can have.
Oh, that's cool.
When you're trying to give yourself and your on-chain funds some privacy. And so that's kind of the idea behind it. And, so folks will be welcome to check that out. That'll be this July at the Bitcoin conference. So.
Hell yeah. That's really cool, actually. Will that be broadcast somewhere to watch later?
I'm sure that we can record it and do something with it. maybe we can even turn it into, or maybe we can even create like some YouTube videos on it or something, and that way,
Yeah.
it can be explained more professionally. Take our time with it, that kind of thing.
Yeah. No, that's a great idea. Well, sweet. Thank you so much. I'll if we do find something concrete with donating to the Samurai guys, if you find it before I do, let me know. I'll make sure to put it
Will do.
retroactively in the show notes. And thanks
Cool.
for coming on, man. This
Yeah.
was an awesome conversation.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure chatting with you.
Hell yeah, man. That will close us out for today. Another shout out to Travis for coming on the show. This was really fun, and it's a perspective that I usually don't travel down, and it's also cool. It's kind of actually like really hopeful to see people, so easy to just kind of like think that everybody's a monolith when they work for some particular institution or they work in some profession. And I love being reminded that there are libertarians, there are Bitcoiners, there are people who understand and have moral foundations everywhere. Even people inside of something like Chainalysis may actually know and specialize and target exactly where they know they're actually doing some sort of good, even though they may disagree with some other things that the institution is doing. So it's a bit of a white pill, and just reminding me, I guess, and hopefully all of us, that there are people of all persuasions and all ideologies and all, philosophical frameworks everywhere. You don't know where that Bitcoiner is. You do not know where there may be a voice of reason trying to push back against a lot of these things. And how much we have a responsibility in that role of trying to be that voice of reason, trying to push back and making it clear when something is ethically wrong to engage in, and to push back when somebody's doing something wrong. And when you are actually involved in such a way where you can be that voice, where you can be that pushback, that resistance against something bad happening. So, that's our obligation where it seems to come across our path. But a shout out to Travis for dedicating and going full into Bitcoin and finding his interest and his passion, like myself. Like, I just couldn't do anything else, and just I loved the conversation. This was such a great conversation. And whenever we do have anything concrete, like I said, for the Samourai Wallet guys, I know a lot of you, myself included, Travis included, are going to want to donate and help push this forward and help make sure that they get the defense that they need, and to stand up and prove it in court that non-custodial should not apply to this, that this is a gross overreach of power and a gross invasion of basic rights of everybody here. And not only that, this will kill the American market and environment. And I think that spells disaster for a country that already has a really, really depressing looking future, with the exception of the little bit of light that peeks through the cracks, and the people who are still trying to be that voice of reason in what is a very big, dark cave, seemingly in recent times. So don't forget to check out the post on Noster. Like I said, I will have that link in the show notes, and to follow Travis and anything else that is related to this, so that you can dig in. I've got a couple of links that I've collected about the case and about what's going on. So if you want to do a little bit more reading on details that we weren't able to cover, that'll be a perfect place. Check it out right there in the show notes. All right, guys. Thank you guys so much for listening. Thank you to Swan and CoinKite for supporting this show and bringing this to you. And I will catch you on the next one. Until then, I'm Guy Swan. Take it easy, guys.